Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be giving a very broad overview of science writing, what it is, the many varied ways that people do science writing, and maybe a little bit of how that shapes the science that you might read about. This is probably going to end up being a very long video, so here's just kind of like the overall structure that I have planned. I'm going to start by introducing myself to give some context for who I am and why I feel like I want to talk about this. If you've been following me for a while, some of this might be familiar, but you know, like there's new people all the time, so I just kind of want to like have, I guess, that starting foundation or whatever for the conversation. Then I'm going to give an overview of what science writing is, and then go through some of the various jobs that I've learned about that like kind of exist in science writing, starting with more of like your technical science writing and then moving up more towards like writing that's geared towards a general audience. A while ago, I put a call out for questions on Twitter and Instagram related to this topic, which I'll get to both kind of during the video if it's related to things that I'm talking about, as well as towards the end of the video, like the things that aren't related to the other topics, I'll get to them towards the end. Some of these questions are more job related, and some of these are more kind of about like the how-tos of science writing. So first off, the introduction. Hi, I'm Deboki. In 2018, I got my PhD in biomedical engineering from Boston University. After that, I was the multimedia intern at Scientific American for 6 months. So while I was there as part of that internship, I did a little bit of podcast stuff, but mostly I worked on videos about science. That involved making animated explainers and then also making some of your more produced interviewee kind of things that were kind of supporting articles that were appearing in the magazine. I wrapped up that internship in December 2018, and since then I've been a freelancer whose specialty is working in multimedia. So that could mean a lot of things, both as a freelancer and as someone who works in multimedia. I've done video projects for nonprofits and academics. I did a non-sciencey social media thing. I also currently am doing 2 ongoing gigs that are somewhat connected. One is that I am Hank Green's editorial assistant. Some of you might know Hank Green from YouTube and Vlogbrothers, or also Complexly and all of this other stuff. So for that editorial assistant job, I help out with researching mostly kind of sciencey stuff for the various podcasts and things that he's involved with, which is a very fun and very cool job that I get to do because I get to learn about so many different things from week to week. I'm also a writer for Journey to the Microcosmos, which is a very cool YouTube channel that you should all watch. It's about microbes. It features some gorgeous microscopy videos that we get to watch and learn about. It's a very soothing channel. I love writing for it. It's one of my favorite things that I get to do. So that is my introduction, as well as a little bit of a shameless plug. I'm planning to do more videos about science writing and freelancing, so if any of this like piques your interest and you like have more things that you want to know, don't worry, I will hopefully get to them. But for now, here are the relevant things that I want to like kind of note from all of that introduction. So one, I have not done, at least yet, any kind of formal journalism or science writing training. There are a number of very good programs out there that are worth looking into if you're considering a job in this arena. These programs can provide both solid training and a network of students, professors, and alums, which I think are of immense value for any kind of job, not just science writing. For me, I went straight from college to grad school, and by the end of grad school, I had spent so much time in school that I was both sort of burnt out, and I also just was like, I feel like I need to engage with the real world. So that for me was kind of like a, I need to not be in school right now kind of thing. That does not mean that I will never seek out these kinds of programs. It's just not where I currently want to be spending my time or get my experience. Number 2, my focus is in multimedia, and particularly video, which is a huge part of the science communication / writing / journalism ecosystem, but it is kind of a weird and unique place to be as a science writer, especially as someone who's coming from a scientific background, which means that a lot of stuff that is covered by most of the people I've met in this field are things that are not necessarily what I do on a daily basis. Number 3, I am very early in my career. While I've been exploring science writing for a while, I am like less than 2 years into like full-time engaging with this field. So I just want you to know that I'm coming at this as someone who is learning about this field, not necessarily as someone who is an expert. Number 4, I am based out of the US, which means that my experience and perspective is very much limited to what I have learned about science communication and the media landscape in the US. So now, the big question, what is science writing? What I've learned is that when you say the word science writing, people kind of interpret those words in very different ways that sort of depend on where you're coming from. For example, when I started thinking about moving into science writing, I would tell my grad school friends and professors, and their assumption is that I was talking about either being an editor for an academic journal or working in technical writing. For me, though, what science writing meant and what it continues to kind of mean for me specifically is more your general kind of writing, like news and whatnot, something for a more general audience. But obviously, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is science and writing. There's a lot of science that gets done every day, some of it in universities, some of it in hospitals, in industry. If we're going to summarize the very, very broad goal of this field, it's to communicate what scientists have learned, maybe in the present, maybe in the past, for an audience. And a lot of what differentiates the various jobs I'm going to be talking about today is who that audience is. Sometimes it's a technical audience who has a lot of familiarity with the subject. Sometimes it's a popular audience who might vaguely know a few terms, and sometimes it's even other science writers. A lot of times when people talk about science writing, the framing is something like scientists are very good at science and not so good at communicating. I think I've used this framing before, but I've decided to abandon that because I think it's kind of annoying and actually misses what the point of communications is. I think when it comes to a thing that you do every day, no matter what that is, no matter how simple it seems, what ends up happening is that you don't know what other people don't know because that's not your job. Your job is to do the one thing. It's not necessarily to be aware of all the things that everyone else doesn't know. You're most likely in a position where you don't have to consider those other points of view. And that's why there's a whole field of communicators out there, not just for science, but like for everything. Though, ironically, a lot of us in the communications business are not necessarily great at explaining our own jobs because, again, that's what happens when you do a thing every day. Sometimes the phrase science writing is interchangeably used with two other words that I think are actually just more specific aspects of science writing and that are also occasionally like overlapping subsets of the field. One is science journalism, which is more your kind of newsy stuff. The other big one is science communication, which often gets shortened down to Scicomm. I recommend checking out the hashtag Scicomm on Twitter if this is something you're more interested in. But I will kind of get into what differentiates those things later on. I just wanted to introduce those now in case those are words you've heard of and are kind of just wondering what their place is in this. With that, we've got this basic idea that we're going to be writing about science for an audience. Now let's break that down into the actual jobs that kind of make up this field. I'm going to start by saying that I got this really great question from Jade over at Bedtime Bookworm. I'll link down to her channel down below. She asked this great question about the level of pay that you can expect to be getting in the kinds of jobs that I'm going to be talking about. And obviously pay is a huge factor in any kind of living. You should be able to make like educated decisions about your jobs based on what you can expect to be making. So I was really hoping to be able to give good information along these lines. But as I was going through the various sources that are out there that have pay information, like, you know, Glassdoor and Google and stuff, I realized it would be hard for me to give those numbers in a way that I was comfortable with. A lot of these jobs are ones that I don't have like direct experience with, so I don't want to like under or over promise, especially as salary information can vary by location as well. A great resource if you're job searching or just getting a sense of the lay of the land is the National Association for Science Writers, which I'll link to down below. They have a mailing list that people use to post job listings, and that is super helpful. So getting into the jobs, on one end of the audience spectrum is the very technical kind of science writing that I alluded to earlier. There's a few jobs in this realm that I've seen while job searching. One type of position is in industry, maybe working for pharma, biotech, or other kind of like techie places where they need writers who are able to process scientific results and translate them into technical or regulatory documents, or maybe grant applications. Because these positions often require understanding pretty technical information, they are usually looking for someone who has scientific experience. Sometimes they'll specifically ask for people who have like a master's or a PhD, but that doesn't mean you can't find jobs in this area if you don't have grad school experience, especially if you do have a lot of post-undergrad technical experience. Back when I was first looking for jobs, I did apply for a position like this at a company whose product was very similar to the kind of things that I was working on in grad school. The specific title for that position was medical writer, and based on the posting, it would involve a lot of working with the clinical and regulatory teams. The listing that I looked at specifically asked for someone with a PhD in life sciences or similar. The application process involved basically your standard resume and cover letter, and I had a phone interview with the person who would end up managing that position, and from my notes it seems like she was a bench scientist who moved over to writing. So this seems like something that you can move into from the research side if that's what you're interested in. From talking to people who have more experience with industry, my understanding is that often people start out in technical or regulatory or medical writing and often move on to more regulatory or management-y kind of positions. So that can be a good place to start out in if that's kind of your long-term goal. I've seen similar positions in academia. They're often based in specific labs or research institutions. I can't find the notes that I have from like the one job that I applied to in this kind of sub area, but I did apply to a position that was basically a science writer for a lab who would be involved with helping to prepare papers, grant applications, presentations, figures, and all of that. To be honest, if I hadn't gone in the direction that I had gone in, this would probably have been like my other favored direction, because I think it would have been fun to like basically be in a lab without having to do the lab work and getting to focus on like talking about it, because that was always my favorite part of being in the lab. I really loved talking about my results more than I sometimes liked getting them. One of the other major categories of jobs on this technical end are journal editors, which I think is actually a relatively common path for PhDs who want to get out of the lab but still want to be involved in the academic world. Journal editors are basically the people who decide whether an academic work is going to actually be published in a journal. They read papers, they send them out to reviewers, they make the final decision about like the comments and the critiques and whatever, basically deciding whether this paper that is being submitted to the journal will be rejected or accepted into it. This makes journal editors super important in the science ecosystem because they basically shape what science is getting published. From what I've seen, and I think this tracks with what this job asks for, these positions usually ask for people who have PhDs, though I do not know if that's always the case. So those are the types of jobs that I kind of associate with the most technical end of science writing. The audience is usually other people who are involved in a particular technical area, whether it's a scientist, a regulator, a grant reviewer, whatever. They're just people who will be able to process things on that technical level. Now we're going to move over more to your general audience, an audience that may need a little bit more context, a little bit more information to process a lot of this technical information, and who maybe don't want to engage with it on that super deep technical level. Let's start with like what I would consider the most extreme version of this. Obviously it's not extreme. We're writing. There's no such thing. But these are jobs that are geared like the most obviously towards a general audience, and that you might also be familiar with. These are your science communicators and your science journalists. I've sort of struggled with how to best define each of those and specifically kind of how to distinguish them from each other, especially because there is, as I said earlier, sometimes some overlap. The way I think of it, and this might not be the best way, so let me know if you disagree, and I might also change my framing in the future. Science communicators are generally geared more towards educating the public about science, while science journalists are more geared towards reporting about what's going on in the world of science. And I think that's a subtle difference, and it's sometimes an overlapping one. It's not always super distinct what is what, and that creates a lot of fuzziness and at times friction. To me, the quintessential science communicator of my youth is Bill Nye the Science Guy, someone whose goal is to teach a general audience about the wonders of science. Nowadays, you might also get scientists on Instagram like Samantha Yamin and her account @ScienceSam. She's a PhD student who uses her Instagram account to talk about like her own research, science myths, grad school life, and a whole lot more. Science journalists are journalists. They're reporters. They're usually applying journalistic standards of rigor to explain and question the state of science to the public. Whether what is often published under the category of science journalism actually meets those standards is an ongoing discussion in both the scientific and journalistic communities, but I have found that good science journalists think and talk about how to ensure their writing is in line with those standards. I am glossing over a lot of conversations that exist about communication and journalistic best practices, but I'm highlighting the fuzziness of those boundaries because I think it's important overall in terms of how you read science, and it's important to me in terms of how I think about what I do. I personally consider the bulk of what I do to be more about science communication than, necessarily like a journalism thing. I'm usually not reporting out a story or anything like that. However, while I really want people to be excited about science, being critical of science is also super important to me, both like in processing the scientific things that I'm going to be talking about and how I want to be talking about them. Sometimes science communicators are framed as like science cheerleaders, which I think comes out of the fact that, that goal is often to talk about science while also being very enthusiastic, to share your enthusiasm, to get other people to be enthusiastic about science. Personally, I believe that the best science communicators are the ones who are able to express science, not just as like exciting results, but also as an ongoing process that has brought out the best and worst in humanity, which involves being excited about it, but also being critical of it. The bulk of the work that I do does lie in the science communication arena to me, but I do look for jobs in both science journalism and science communication, so obviously I have a lot of feelings about getting jobs in this area. One thing to keep in mind, and I say this with a lot of love and gratitude and unfounded optimism, media can be kind of a shit show. It can be competitive, it can be low paying, it can be unstable. There's a lot of super talented people applying for not that many jobs. But my experience has been that people in this field are also very kind and helpful and generous because we know that we're all in the same shitty boat together and everyone just wants to do the best they can. This is a field that involves a lot of collaboration, so I think that informs a lot of that as well. I got my start via an internship, which was extremely helpful for me as someone coming out of science and needing to both build their skills and network. If you're in the same boat and can do it, I highly recommend going to AAAS in February and attending the National Association for Science Writers internship fair. I'll link to more information about the conference down below. I did not actually get an internship out of the internship fair, but it's probably one of the most important things that I did for myself because it helped me kind of talk to a lot of people, figure out what kind of internships were out there, and figure out how to market myself. It also gave me some contacts that I still talk to this day, so I am just very pro taking advantage of this opportunity because it's the best way to get to talk to people in this field face to face about what you want to do. Another great resource that I'll link to down below is a list of internships that was put together by Erin Winnick, who is a science writer who currently works at NASA. I will link to that as well as her Instagram and Twitter because she's a great follow if you're interested in this kind of thing. And the last opportunity that I'm going to talk about in this regard is the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship, which is geared towards placing people who have a sciencey background. I think it's geared towards people in grad school in different newsrooms during the summer. It is competitive. I applied twice and didn't get it, but I've met a number of mass media fellows since then, and it seems like a really great way to build your community early on in your career as well as get invaluable experience at really great newsrooms. Outside of internships, you can also build up a portfolio in science writing in a bunch of different ways that I am not personally a huge expert on. I know there are places like Massive Sci, which works with scientists to sort of develop their writing for a broader audience, and I know people who have used that to start building their own portfolio. Another option that will be relevant to the category of jobs I'm going to be talking about next is if you're in school to find your university's press office and ask if you can write for them. At least that was the thing that was suggested to me. Again, I did not do this, so I can't speak to how easy this is, but I know that it's something that quite a number of people pursue. You can also just go all out and just pitch people. You are fully allowed to contact editors at places that you are interested in to pitch them articles and whatever that you want to write. There are some great resources for figuring out how to do that. One of them is the Open Notebook, which is this fantastic website. It's a free resource for everyone. They have all of these great articles about how to do science writing featuring some amazing science writers. There's also a pitch database where you can read people's successful pitches. So I think that is a really good place to look to if you're just like, how do you even pitch? I also have the Science Writer's Handbook, which is a very thorough book that is kind of like everyone's go-to rec for information about science writing as a career. So like that is the Scicomm science journalism side of the general audience kind of category of jobs. The other sort of general category type job thing, but with a more specific goal in mind, these are your sort of like PR type jobs or jobs that are done on behalf of institutions but geared towards a broader audience. Some of these jobs are actually just like straight up PR jobs. There are companies that might have their own in-house communications people. They might have an agency that does PR for them. Basically, you know, if they need help in marketing products, handling publicity, like whether negative or positive, like providing education to the public, that will help them as well. These are kind of what those PR jobs will handle. When I was first looking for jobs, I actually did talk to a PR agency that specializes in like life sciences type work. And a lot of the people that I talked to were PhDs who in their job were doing kind of a whole bunch of things. They were going to medical meetings with clients, writing scripts for videos, writing press releases, and so on. I think this particular agency was a little bit more unique in terms of having a PhD contingent. My impression is that these jobs do not necessarily require a PhD, but a PhD is an advantage if you're applying for them. Like I alluded to earlier, universities and research institutions also have their own press offices or public information officers who help coordinate the communications from scientists who might have exciting work come out. These PIOs might write press releases or help coordinate with journalists who want to ask more questions, or they might also write for the institution website or like other official institution magazines. You'll see these kinds of jobs at places like NASA too, because you know, those kinds of places are just basically big research agencies that want people to know more about the kind of work that's going on, especially if they're a public institution supported by taxpayer money. It's important to be able to connect back to the public and explain to them, like, this is all the cool stuff that's happening. Some academic journals also have their own press offices because they might have a big, exciting paper come out and they want journalists to know about it. If you're interested in knowing what like a press release for scientific research looks like, I recommend checking out Eureka Alert, which is sort of like this big collection of news releases, like everything else. I'll link down to it below. This is a whole part of the scientific ecosystem, like not just the science writing ecosystem, but just like science. And I think it goes underappreciated by the public, probably because it's not super well known. I think a lot of us understand the role of PR and news releases in say like celebrity news or sports news, but it's weird to realize that it's also part of how our science gets distributed. There are news releases that get put out that you can only access for a certain amount of time if you're a journalist, and those releases are under embargo, which means that no one can publish anything about it until a specific date, which is usually when the paper that the release is describing is getting published. So like when you see a whole bunch of tweets or articles about like a major discovery that all come out on like a Thursday, it might be because there's a journal that publishes on Thursday and that has like had everyone on embargo about that specific like research finding until then. And also going back to the jobs of it all and also like the shitty media landscape, a lot of people in media work in this area because it is generally better paying and more stable than say journalism. That means that a big conversation going on in science journalism and kind of I think in journalism overall is conflicts of interest, because if you're reporting a story that is related to something that you've been paid to also publicize, that can be an issue. This comes up at media organizations as well. One way to make a more steady source income if your company is producing media is to allow sponsorships, or in the case of multimedia, to produce custom media. So for example, videos that are made for specific brands. These types of things are, or at least always should be, noted and kept editorially independent from the journalism side of things. So that is the like very broad overview. I am missing a lot of jobs in there, like people who work in museums and other cool shit, but I hope it was helpful. So I'm just gonna take a moment to get into some of the other questions that I've gotten that didn't quite fit into that discussion. First off, can you get into science writing without a master's in science communication or English? Yes, I think so. At least I've met people who have. I personally don't have a master's in either of those things. I do have a bachelor's in English because I double majored with my bioengineering degree, but I don't think that really helped me. But there are a lot of science writers like me who are just coming at this from a scientific background. So people kind of let you slide in if you have the technical experience or if you have something else that demonstrates that you have skills in writing and or communication. I also got a question about whether or not you can get this kind of job if you're not great at public speaking. And judging by some of the science writers I've met, yes, definitely, which is fine. Not everyone has to be a good public speaker. There are so many ways to apply communication skills, writing, graphics, whatever. There's so many parts to this job. You do not have to be a good public speaker. Being a good public speaker is just an advantage that can help you out because it can help you communicate face to face, but not a requirement. Another question was what's hardest about the transition from scientist to science communicator? I think a weird part of making that transition is that you're really changing your position relative to the science, like kind of relative to what you're talking about. As a scientist, you are the expert, which is not to say that you know everything, but you know what you know and also, what you don't know. As a science communicator, even if you know the subject really well, you still have to take the position of a non-expert because that is the best way, I think, to identify how to talk about it to other non-experts. That's a thing that you have to really be aware of. I think making that transition requires a certain type of humility, which is sometimes hard because being humble sucks. A related question, how does Scicomm differ from writing for journals? How do you get better at it? How do you know what needs more or less explanation? I find writing for journals to be deeply soul-sucking. It has minimal personality, at least with how we write academic papers today, or at least academic scientific papers. For me, when Scicomm is at its most fun, it's because you get to bring like a lot of different elements that are extraneous to journal writing. You get to talk about like the people, like the ups, the downs, like all of these other facets to science that aren't gonna make it into a journal. Like I got to work on this video about amoebas, which ended up being super exciting because I went into it thinking why do we reference amoebas so much in pop culture? And that was a thing I sort of got to get to in the video because I was just interested in it. And you can't really do that in an academic journal. As for how to get better, I think there's kind of the obvious stuff, with any kind of writing, just read a lot and write a lot. I also think figuring out your audience is super helpful, and obviously it's going to change. But the common phrase that people use to describe this is to ask yourself, how would you explain this to your grandmother? And I hate that. My grandmother had a PhD in chemistry. She started the chemistry department in the women's college that she taught at. I understand why people say this thing this way, but I think it's stupid because it's both sexist and useless, like many sexist things. General audience, which is a thing I've been saying throughout this, is also a very, very broad term, and you can't represent it with some stock sexist and ageist image of a science ignorant person. My audience on this channel might be different from the audience for other places I write for. In fact, a lot of those different places have their own specific niches of general audience. You have to figure out what that specific niche is that you're writing for so you can figure out what you want your writing to accomplish and how you have to accomplish it. Regarding how to figure out what needs more or less explanation, I'm someone who loves including all of the details. I will include 50 details, too many, and then only cut them out when the word count forces me to. So I'm not sure that I'm the best person to ask. Basically, my answer is word counts. Somehow, I will think a thing needs 1,000 words, and then you'll tell me I only have 200 words, and magically, somehow, you just figure it out. And the last question for now is what makes a good portfolio? And I wish I knew, and I'm honestly still figuring this out. I think for me, at this point in my career, what I hope my portfolio says is that I've done multimedia stuff at various different levels. I've done animation, voiceover, writing, scripting, production, and more. And I've said this before on this channel, I was very surprised by how much having my own YouTube channel, even one as kind of unprofessional as this one, was actually a huge help when I applied for internships and actually since then. When I was applying for internships, this channel was my portfolio, which was kind of embarrassing. facing, right? Like I'm including what I think of as like this dinky review of a book or like something where I've talked about grad school. But like even though like I'm personally proud of those videos and just like was kind of embarrassed to be like, here, take it seriously, I think what it showed is that like I had a basic familiarity with YouTube and writing for video that combined with having a PhD is actually kind of unique. So I think what makes a good portfolio is the thing that helps you establish what you can do. I'm sorry, that's like a very wishy-washy answer. But I think that's kind of what applying for jobs is. It's figuring out what you have and what kind of scraps of it that you can take to market yourself. So that was a lot. I really hope this was helpful. I may have bitten off like more than I could reasonably chew in one video, but I'm also really glad to have like thrown so much into one video because I know when I was getting started, I was just like overwhelmed with just how much there is to this world. And honestly, like even a few years in, I'm still figuring out the landscape. I would like to make more videos about science writing. I like did this in grad school. I made my Not My Thesis series because I like talking about like my work. So yeah, this is a thing I'm planning to continue. The next one I'm planning to work on is a reflection on my first year of freelancing. So if you have questions about that, let me know down below. And if there are any other questions or topics you'd like for me to get to, also put those down below because I will use them. I will shamelessly steal them as inspiration for future videos. So yeah, thank you guys for watching and bye.